fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
I was talking to somebody else about this the other day, actually, that it's the atomization of the family, that we fetishize things that are a taboo, but they're a taboo, but there's an underlying value, and so there's a conflict between the taboo and the value, and then you fetishize it because it's like a private way of glorifying that thing without making it. Because I mean, fetishes aren't public, right? So, so the whole thing with the with fetishizing incest, or with fetishizing these really strangely broken family relationships, is specifically because there are so many of them. Like, you couldn't fetishize, relationships between stepdaughter and stepfather in the 1940s and 50s, because that wasn't a relationship that existed commonly, so you couldn't build a market out of that. But you can now, because it's so common. So, and now it's so common that you might not even be a person who has a direct relationship with one of those family structures. It's just that they've seen it so often, and the taboo is so raw for them, maybe because they have a best friend or somebody who is in that situation, that they become, So I don't know. It's fucked up.
I
That's
liked
what I'll say.
I liked a point you said there, where one thing that seems to be happening is that, like you said, it's a taboo, it's a sexual thing, it's something where we can dabble in, and it's private, so we're allowed to, which is what many liberals will say, actually, that, I'm not racist, but I only date within my race, but it's just my dick, it's what I'm attracted to, it's not a conscious or ideological thing, but they're allowed to do that because they're like, oh, what am I going to do? It's my dick. I'm turned on by what I turned on. I have no control, which is actually in line completely with the progressive liberal worldview, that there's just this phenomena that happens and we can't control it, and we shouldn't try to control it. You're just, the winds of gay have carried me away. But, politically, if we want to look at this from a geopolitical point of view, you are merely increasing the sovereignty of your genitals in making your decisions. In our desire to be racist, we're not allowed to square that with the society we're in. We're not allowed to actually be racist unless we increase the decision-making capabilities of our genitals and cede more power to our dicks. Yeah. Then we're allowed to be as radical as we want.
Yeah. See, here's the thing. My dick
penis nationalism.
My dick thinks that Indians are smelly and they eat with their mouths open, and I hate it when I have to talk to them on customer service, but it's my penis, so don't worry about it.
It's my penis believes black people steal, and you can't tell me to change what my penis thinks. Hey, give it a shot. I'm open for whatever we can. Like I said, get a botnet. Start fabricating licenses, driver's licenses.
Reach a point where it's like the 1970s VHS documentaries of Free to Choose with Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell. So like both of them just have their dicks out, just waving them in the air as they talk, like as a way of convincing everyone that this is a legitimate argument.
This will follow every successful revolution the right has ever done. We're getting an old Jewish guy and a black guy to be at the forefront of it. This is how we win.
That's right. I'm sorry I used that example now that I think of it, but yeah, you're right.
No, it's too late. You're in this now. You're locked in the good idea box with me. Increasing this is how we, there's a lot of different ways to approach the tragedy of great power politics, but I think this is how we do it in 2022. Radical penis nationalism. Speaking of that, I guess that really does segue right into the next thing I wanted to talk about.
Are you trying to attract the ire of the chat on your pronunciation?
I don't like how people are zooming my speech. Like, I've already copped to that I don't pronounce names properly. I had Faust in there saying I spelled joie de vivre wrong, and you guys are gonna feel real fucking stupid when I cry.
It's I'm pretty sure it's Segway.
Oh no, I knew that was on purpose.
Okay, see, that's why I'm asking. See, I know because you realistically though, and for the listeners, anybody paying attention, you and I have a bit where we've been doing this for so long that we intentionally mispronounce things like as a gag, like as a dad joke. But at some point, I no longer know when you're doing it, and I don't know if you know when I'm doing it because I do it a lot. Like I as a gag, I intentionally, especially French shit, I intentionally pronounce French names with an anglicized accent as a way of mocking them. But then people are like, "Oh, you did that wrong." It's like, yeah, fuck you. It's because I hate the French. Like it's intentional.
Well, this follows in line with a lot of the most successful bits on the right broadly, which is becoming retarded. So that's like a lot of our jokes that we come up with. A lot of the best legendary bits are us just becoming mental retards,
Just getting dumb.
and standing on the shoulders of giants, and those giants are standing upon a carnival of piss and cum.
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of happy birthday balloons used as condoms.
Damn,
I don't know.
that's an image. Jesus.
Don't imagine it, please. I do. Okay, sorry. Disclaimer: anytime I'm giving you guys a tableau where I'm weaving an image, don't imagine it.
Analyze it logically before allowing it into your imagination. That should be a rule. Yeah.
There's many different ways to come at a bit. Come at it from the mathematical angle first,
Yeah.
then the geopolitical angle, then the anthropological angle. Once you're safe, conjure the image in your mind.
No, that's true. When you're gonna come at a bit, you should definitely grab a paper towel and aim upward to the left and close your left eye. And yeah.
Oh, jeez. Oh, Jesus. Oh, Jesus, you turned me fucking Irish. All right. Yeah, we're going to do the rest of this in a Keith Woods voice.
Oh, no, please. He doesn't even deserve it. He's got a tiny neck and a little pinhead.
He's using turtleneck maximalism to increase the size of his neck, but, the male fashion gurus amongst us know that this is a fool's errand.
Yes.
If you sacrifice your clout to the fool's turtleneck, there's no going back.
That's right. He'll die with that turtleneck.
The elders of clout will ding you. Well, I'll even ding you posthumously. I have no values. I'm 5 seconds away of selling out every single one of my principles for a crossbow. All right. I got like a sneeze living in my face right now.
Get her.
Ah! Do you ever get that? You want to sneeze and it just goes in your face?
Oh, man, I know.
What's going on? Look away! Turn off the show.
Stand up, take a little walk. Have a walk.
This is grotesque. I shouldn't be allowed on the air. All right.
Put your fist through the drywall.
I did that. I think if here's a tip. Before we get into the thing, here's a tip for all the fellas out there. Once every few months, punch a hole in the drywall.
Yeah.
You need to show your woman how strong you are and let her know that you have the capability to be unhinged. I was telling my wife this the other. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
No, carry on.
I was going to say, I said this to my wife the other day because we're talking about building materials. I'm like, why don't we have something better than drywall? Why haven't drywall seems cheap? It seems easily breakable. I'm saying no, because dudes rock, and we know that dudes rock, and we must continue dudes rocking. So we purposefully make drywall something that can be punched. It looks cool. Yeah. You want to put your fist through it. Drywall is the perfect consistency. They can put your fist through it. It's not going to fuck up your hand, but it looks impressive. And the guys, we get together, not consciously, but we handicap the strength of our building materials, because if we need to be able to at any time know that we can karate chop through some wood. We can make invincible wood if we wanted to, but we need to have the option for karate chops to frighten women.
So my take is gyprock, gypsum board, plaster, you know, these building materials as interior framing. I mean, we might even frame the building in something more rigid, but we then use those as an interior, like the interior, are from a very functional standpoint. Yes, you can punch your fist through them, but for the same reason that you can punch your fist through them, you can use your masculine arm to hang a painting or a shelf or cut a new doorway or place a wall where there once was a doorway or all of these other things. So there's two. No, really.
You just wall people in.
No, really. It's like The Sims. Like they go to take a shit and you build a wall when they're not looking. But,
That your wife needs to know that you can do this.
right.
You can remove the door.
That's what I was gonna say. Like on the one hand, this is something that you can destroy, but the foil to that is this is something that you can create. You aren't just a destroyer, you are a creator. So it's less about you being able to break it, and it's more about this is your clay. And I wonder if that was it's definitely not a conscious motivation, but it's like a gene culture coevolution type thing where we moved from stone buildings to timber buildings and from timber buildings to like gypsum board, because in gypsum board men who were capable were could not only knock the whole fucking place down with their arms with no tools, they could literally collapse the house around themselves, or they could redecorate it in one afternoon, right? One or the other. So it's not so much that you need to be able to punch a hole in the wall. You need to be able to punch a hole in the wall and then fix it and have it repainted by the following morning. That's the trick.
That is the trick, because there's a great bonding exercise for you and your woman is her helping you patch over the hole you just punched.
Yes.
And my wife, I've cultivated a strong marriage. My wife knows that at any time I please, I could run through this entire fucking house like the Kool-Aid Man.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what room you're in. She's always looking sideways, like he could come through that wall at any moment.
She knows that I can do that, or like The Sims, I can brick her into the bed. She's going to wake up and there's stone walls all around her while she slumbered. And you can't say that it's gaslighting, because that's all women care about is gaslighting. This isn't gaslighting. These are direct, impossible threats.
Yeah.
The female brain doesn't know how to parse through direct and impossible threats. And that leads us to the tragedy of great power politics.
Here we go.
So this is a book that I really like, and it's written by John Mearsheimer. And Mearsheimer is a name that might sound familiar to people who are at all interested in geopolitics, like we discussed with Lutwak yesterday. These are guys who are still around, by the way. So I wanted to preface this by saying, if you find this sort of thing interesting, if you found our coverage of the coup d'etat system very interesting, these guys are out there. They're on shows. There's interviews with them. If you want these minds to weigh in on China or weigh in on the conflict in Ukraine, you could, and they do. And which I think is important for them to test their hypotheses. So these guys, they have these systems of how things operate in a geopolitical sense, and then they make predictions, and whether or not those predictions come true, they're valid or not. So these guys, we can actually look to them right now and listen to them. They have several books. I'm just covering one. And if you want to look more at Mearsheimer in detail, you can. But this book he had written was The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. It's the updated edition right now. It's a very large book, and it lays out, in essence, his worldview. And his worldview is distinct. And I think he's had a good run of predicting world events in a very practical way. And what he's known for is taking more of a practical approach and not an ideological or spiritual approach, a non-philosophical approach, where some people disagree with him. And look, and when we cover this, there might be certain things that I disagree with. There might be certain predictions he makes or others make that fail. But I think the core of his worldview is very interesting. And I think people should pay attention to it because I think it does explain a lot.
What we're talking about is dealing with a really complicated world, a world that's very hard to make sense of. And what we do, as I said before, is we invent theories, which are simplifications of reality that help us understand that complicated world. Well, if you're going to simplify reality and come up with a simple theory, and simple theories are the best theories, that means you're going to leave some factors on the cutting room floor. In other words, some factors that matter in international politics are not going to be incorporated into your theory because you think they are not very important. Neorealism, or structural realism, pays little attention to domestic politics. It says you don't need domestic politics to understand how the world works. It's, again, the structure of the system that's largely determinative. But sometimes domestic politics really matters. And that factor that you left on the cutting room floor jumps up and influences a particular set of events.
So his worldview is called offensive realism, which sounds funnier than it is. But offensive realism is a reaction to the liberal worldview. So what is the liberal worldview? Well, in short, if we want to kind of steelman it shortly, it was the liberal assumption is that democracies tend not to go to war with other democracies. And you'll hear liberals say this, progressives especially, that we only go to war with the bad guys and the dictators. Democracies don't go to war with democracies. Also, that free trade ends war because everyone wants to accumulate wealth. So they'll say, if everyone's democratic and everyone embraces globalist free trade, then there will be no such thing as war or conflict. Again, this is something they openly say. And therefore, dictatorships in all forms are bad. I think that's an important one. So it doesn't matter what the dictatorship is, doesn't matter what the people are, all forms of dictatorship are bad according to them. And in this sense, independence of the people must be sought at all costs. So now, offensive realists believe, where they overlap with liberals, is that they believe that the state is the primary actor in global affairs, but great powers are more influenced by external influences than internal influences. And that a calculation of power dynamics dominates states' thinking regardless of whether they like it or not. So he's saying that it doesn't actually matter if you're a democracy or a dictatorship or anything like that. You actually operate more or less the same and using the exact same calculations, regardless of who is running it and regardless of what ideology is dominant in your system. So that would mean that, modern day Britain would make the same calculations based on power and influence that Saudi Arabia would make, and the same that North Korea would make.
Basically, what I am is a structural realist. I'm a person who believes that it's the structure of the international system, it's the architecture of the international system that explains in large part how states behave. Another way to say that is I do not believe that domestic politics, I do not believe that the composition or the makeup of individual states matters very much for how those states behave on a day-to-day basis in international politics.
So it's all kinds of same. Now, people can disagree with that or kind of pick that apart, but I think the case he makes is very solid, in my opinion, that, they will place these sort of geopolitical interests above even their own values and even their own principles, and that there actually isn't some better spirit to democracy than there is any other dictatorship if you just look at how nations behave. Not how they say they'll behave and not even the reasons justifying the way they behave. America is a great example. Like, how many inconvenient democracies has America toppled? We can start with that. Everyone knows that. That's probably the best example. Like, there are socialist democracies that popped up that America, despite wanting to spread democracy and freedom, thought were inconvenient and decided to install their own democratic leader who turned out to be a dictator. But in the case of, centralizing their power, they didn't seem to care, so forget what they say. Look at how nations actually behave. That's kind of what this is about.
Right.
And Americans especially hate power politics. They hate this sort of thing because for Americans and Canadians and a lot of Western people, they need to see themselves as the hero. They need to have a good guys versus bad guys story in geopolitics. And he has a name for this that I like. It's called the legalistic moralistic approach. That they believe that everything they do is not only moralistic, but that there is some sort of universal human rights, that there's a judge, there's a series of judges. So they take a legalistic moralistic approach, whereas Mearsheimer says that if you look at the world and the great nations, and we'll get into the details about that in a second, if you look at it, it's really just anarchy. There is no central governing force. There is no universal human rights, really. We won't get into that, but we all know, we might talk about it, but there isn't. So we have global anarchy and how people behave in that anarchy. And it doesn't actually matter what you say you want to do. It matters what you actually do. So to go into that a bit deeper, he says there are three systems in the world for balancing power. One, it's bipolar. So this would be the Cold War. This would be like two great powerful nations in the world, and they're mainly against each other, or there's two great nations. Or there's balanced multipolar or unbalanced multipolar. So there's either two, or then there's a bunch, and then they're either completely balanced, which doesn't really happen. It's never really happened, or unbalanced multipolar. And the unbalanced multipolar world is the most prone to violence. And I think that's obvious. And this is where you would get Europe during World War I and World War II. And we won't get into the exact history of World War I and World War II, but the idea of an equal sharing of power. Now, what unbalances everything, what causes an unbalanced power structure is usually technology, and usually this thing called latent power. And I'll get to that in a second. But with a bipolar system like America versus the Soviet Union, it's actually easier to balance. We talked about this before when we talked about in physics what's called the third body problem. So in physics, and I'm sure people are bored of this, but in physics, if you have like two objects in orbit around each other, it's very easy to predict their orbits. It's very easy to predict long-term what will happen. You introduce a third body, the amount of destabilization it creates too many variables, and the system flies apart, and it becomes pretty much untenable and unpredictable long-term. And that's kind of what it is. So the more complexity you add, so people might actually like a bipolar system. As scary as the Cold War was, from a geopolitical stance, every other country in the world kind of knew where they stood. They could figure that out and create a balance based on that, despite how conflicted it was. But you include all these other powers, including nuclear weapons, including new technology. Let's say it's AI. Let's say it's space travel. All of a sudden, things get very, very complicated, and you might actually be more prone to conflict and violence. And also, the thing is, he thinks is very important. And again, this might be something people disagree with, but I'm not sure I do disagree with it. But he says it really comes down to population size. So, and he says there's two types of power a state commands, and this is kind of what he's getting at here. Two types of power. It's the military power you have on hand, and what's called latent power, which I just talked about. What is latent power? Well, latent power is its wealth. And what is wealth? Well, wealth is actually the intersection of population and economics. So wealth isn't just how much money you have. Wealth is like how much money you have, plus your industry, plus your productive capabilities, plus, most importantly, how much of that power you can call to your command if you need to. So, like, you might have a lot of money, but if you are kind of an unstructured nation where the industry is not really committed to you, can leave at any point, and if the people don't actually like you, this is what the situation America is in right now. Now, America has a lot of military power. I actually don't think America has a lot of latent power in a lot of ways, whereas China does. China, despite what you think about China has the ability to marshal its forces at a state level way more than America does, because America is too fragmented on identity lines. How many, we talk about this a lot, how many people living in Canada and America would actually enthusiastically fight to defend it? In Canada especially, I don't think a lot of, like, most immigrants wouldn't. Let's just start with that, and how many people in America hate America and would never want to defend it? A lot of white people are like that now too. So it's like, how much latent power, how much actual power can it command inside of itself to bring if a fucking foreign enemy was knocking at the door? Not as much as you might think, but that's kind of how you measure power and actually measure wealth. And actually why America is so concerned about a place like China or a place like Russia even. Russia is a different case, but China especially, because it's configured in a way where America can't even really wrap its head around that. Even though China has a lot of flaws and everything. Anyway. And so latent power and wealth is directly tied to new technology. Now, and this is why the power of a nation is traditionally tied to how much a nation can industrialize and automate. That was, the Industrial Revolution. And then it came to information technology. This is why you see a lot of developing countries just trying to catch up, because to even have a seat at the table, you need to not only have a good manufacturing base, but you have to have a good command of IT. This is the story of India, if anyone's curious. Like their attempts to become a global superpower, but they're just like decades behind everyone else. So there's, a lot of these countries are just playing catch up, but it's very disorganized anyway. This is why when people say, "Oh, India is superpower by 2019, whatever," whatever, we keep pushing the date up, but it's like, okay, but really, what do you mean by superpower? Like, take a hard look at your country. How disjointed is it? You might have money and you might be buying and selling, but that's actually a bit of a fog of what you represent as a nation and your ability to make these to work on bigger projects. Basically, I won't go down that too much, but you kind of see what I'm getting at there. And one thing he says about, you probably think, okay, bipolar. What about if one country ran the world? What doesn't America kind of run the world? He says no. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So he says there's never really in the history of the world been like one actual global hegemon. And that means a hegemon is someone who directly controls their area. So there's never been a time in human history where one nation really controlled everything. However, what you can get is what America and Britain actually, but America is actually trying to do with what they call the Eurasian strategy, which is, okay, it's actually impossible for one nation to control the entire world because of just practical issues in oceans. So, projecting power across an ocean is very, very difficult. And this traditionally, historically, was why Britain was such a powerful force, because, you can say a lot about the Anglo work ethic, industrialization, sure, but also the fact that it was on an island helped a lot. That really helps more than people think. So the ability, that means you're kind of insulated from a lot of types of invasions. Very hard to get invaded across a large body of water. But the ability to project hard power across a huge body of water is very, very hard. It's easier to do if you keep everyone else destabilized, though. That's kind of what America does. So he says what a nation can do is the biggest in this world, and maybe this will change in the future, but he said the best you can do is be a regional hegemon. And he said that's what America is. In North America, continental North America, the United States of America owns the entire continent. That's not even up for debate. Canada, Mexico, that part in between that no one fucking thinks about. That's all America. Everyone kind of knows that. The question is, and for a long time, we're trying to figure out what will Asia be dominated by. That's kind of what's going on right now. But he said the biggest you can hope to do is be a regional hegemon in your region, and then hope that the rest of the world is so destabilized they don't actually create a solid argument against you or a force that could make your life difficult. So rather than America saying, we're going to control the entire world, all they need to do is own North America, which is an ideal place to be. You own that continent. No one can invade you. Fucking forget about it. But then you can project enough power to keep everyone kind of confused and destabilized and against each other so that no one coordination can rise up against you. And that's why, and a lot of people, we talked about this when we discussed the book, The Grand Chessboard by Brzezinski, about how since the mid 20th century, America has been very open and vocal about why they are pursuing their interests in what they call Eurasia. This is the Eurasian movement, that we want to prevent an alliance between Russia, China, maybe even Iran, and maybe a few others. But we want to prevent that. And the only reason they want to prevent it isn't, believe it or not, isn't because they hate the Chinese. It isn't because they hate the Russians. And it isn't because they hate the fucking Iranians, really. But they're just worried that them getting together and creating a parallel unity, whatever force that takes, is just going to take a huge bite of America's pie. So it works in their mind. It works for everyone. If, okay, you guys just stay confused and fucked up and we'll deal with you, but we just don't want you gaining that sort of sovereignty. That's really it. And he says, regardless of ideology, regardless of spirituality, regardless of history, if you are a state, if you are a great power, that's kind of the language you think in. And you don't have to have anything personally against these nations. You just know it's bad news for me if I get a contender across that ocean. Yeah. So all of a sudden NATO makes sense, right? All of a sudden these things like, oh, I actually don't need any more explanation than that. And we can go off on all kinds of historical reasons about the true nature of the Russian people, and we can go back to the fucking 1200s. We can go back to the fall of Rome to explain why this happens. You can. I'm sure that's relevant in some way, but from a strictly practical way, removing all of that, they would still behave this way. You would still... This is actually what's uniting a lot of the Eurasianist movements, kind of the Duginist thing. It's like, we actually don't know how we're going to get along. We just want to fight America. And for now, that's enough for us. That's kind of where they're coming from. If you listen to Dugin and a lot of these people, I won't get into that. And so, but he says one of his things about power, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but it makes sense, I guess. He says to actually own land, you have to hold it. And this is where traditionally, I think a lot of, I gotta stop saying traditionally, I'm sorry, but historically, a lot of imperiums have fallen because you actually are not able to keep a strong hold on the areas you have that are supposed to be under your umbrella. You need people on the ground now. And he makes a claim, and we actually talked about this in the coup d'etat book last week, but here's something to consider. And my reasoning for this might sound dumb, but I think it's relevant, where it's like, okay, it's very hard to actually win a war or hold a country with just air support or naval support. You need boots on the ground. You need guys in the streets. Now they say, well, why is that? Like, why you can't really break a people unless you have boots on the ground. Like you could be aware that your nation is encircled by ships and there's planes in the air, but it doesn't actually become real to people unless they see the soldiers in the streets. And I think you can call it psychological, you can call it whatever you want, but I think people need to be broken that way. You won't know that you are part of another imperium or whatever unless you see representations of that in your everyday life. Right. And I think a lot of imperium building, we could look at Napoleon, we can look at even Great Britain. They didn't want to have that. Britain did for a while. But like it's not real. And this is why blockades don't work. He gets into this later in the book. It's like, oh, how do you fight these nations? It's like, oh, except a trade blockade. But trade blockades aren't real for people. It's not visceral. Like it's not, you're kind of aware that shipping lanes are fucked up. And actually, this is why this thing always fucking fails. This is why when they talk about no-fly zones, they talk about sanctioning Russia. They're hoping that it turns the Russian people, or whoever it might be that they're targeting, but the Russian people against their government. That's never happened. What it does actually is it unites the people against you. Like right. Starving people out has never had people turn against their fucking government. It didn't work in the Soviets. Like, fuck you. Like,
so the question is, what went wrong here? And as some of you know, my argument is that nationalism trumps liberalism and realism trumps liberalism. And what happened here is that liberalism ran into two different buzzsaws. One was nationalism, and the other is realism. And let me just take a few minutes to lay this out for you. Let's just talk about the Bush Doctrine. The idea that the United States can invade countries and do social engineering in those countries, especially at the end of a rifle barrel, in the age of nationalism, is foolish in the extreme. Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And it's very clear that if you invade a country like Iraq or Afghanistan, you are eventually going to go from being a liberator to being an occupier. And once you become an occupier, nationalism kicks in, and there's tremendous resistance from the people who live in this country.
Anyway, that's one. They go into these tactics, but like it has to be real for people. You need to see guys with guns, and maybe there will be a future where that doesn't happen. But he makes a claim that you can't, and I'm likely to stand with him on that. And just like he's saying, it's impossible to have a global hegemon. It's impossible to have one nation that controls the world. Maybe there is a one world government down the road, but it would have to look like something different. It'd have to be something supranational. It would need to be something outside of a nation. You would need something like, I don't know, the Bilderberg Group or whatever. But we're just talking nations here. He's got a line here that I really like about how every nation talks about how they're trying to fight for world peace, but no one actually wants world peace.
Right.
He says, the claim is sometimes made that great powers can transcend realist logic by working together to build an international order that fosters peace and justice. World peace, it would appear, can only enhance a state's prosperity and security. America's political leaders paid considerable lip service to this line of argument over the course of the 20th century. President Clinton said, for example, but he says something about the UN here. I'll just skip that part. But the rhetoric notwithstanding, great powers do not work together to promote world order for its own sake. Instead, each seeks to maximize its own share of world power, which is likely to clash with the goal of creating a sustaining, stable international order. This is not to say that great powers never aim to prevent wars and keep the peace. On the contrary, they work hard to deter wars in which they would be the likely victim. In such cases, however, state behavior is driven largely by narrow calculations about relative power, not by a commitment to build a world order independent of a state's own interests. The United States, for example, devoted enormous resources to deterring the Soviet Union from starting a war in Europe during the Cold War, not because of some deep-seated commitment to promoting peace around the world, but because American leaders feared that a Soviet victory would lead to a dangerous shift in the balance of power. So he's just kind of saying that whatever the rhetoric is, he makes a point that really, and this ties into my previous point about how blockades don't work, that what a nation really wants is security and prosperity. Those are the two things, right? And actually, at every level of human organization, that seems to be what it is. And so we, not to go off into this, but like, what is a nation? What is a great power? Mm-hmm. Actually, I'll just start with that. Like, what is a great power? He says there's been 5 great powers in the past 150 years. He says Japan from 1868 to the end of World War II, Germany from Bismarck until Hitler, the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1991, the UK from 1792 to 1945, and the US from 1800 to 1990. So there's not a lot of great powers. But when we talk about great powers, we're talking about like the big guys, the ones who manage to control a lot of power. And you can make an argument maybe China's at a great power level right now. We'll see. That's debatable, but he says what they want is security and prosperity. So that's a nation. But if you look at what the community is, it's the same thing. What does a human community want? They want prosperity and they want security. And that's kind of what a family is like too. And like when we were talking about the ancient city, how's a city formed? A city traditionally isn't just a bunch of buildings you put up and fill with people. A city is grown like a great tree throughout time. That's what Paris was. That's what New York was. You started off with a group of people who wanted, and they got bigger. So you have a family, family joined with other families. They make a clan. Then a clan joins with other clans, and then they make, like a town or a community, and then you build up from there. And that's how a lot of the rise of these great cities are also the rise of family dynasties. You go to Japan, you go to China, you go to all throughout Asia, it's the story of these great families. But that's because it grew out from the desire for prosperity and security. And at every level, what is causing these groups of people to join? Usually it's like, okay, we need to join our forces to make sure we're not invaded and fucked up and raped and burned. That's why you do it. That's kind of why we build a community. If you're an individual, I need to join a community. I need prosperity and safety. And that it goes right up to a nation. And if you look at the formation of something like Germany or Italy, what caused Italy to become Italy? Whereas before it was just the a smorgasbord of little kingdoms and fiefdoms and nations and monarchies. You eventually do that because like we need to get together because there's this other power centralization going on and we need to keep up. We can't just be so disorganized. Despite our disagreements, that's what Machiavelli's The Prince, a lot of it was about like, here's how you actually kind of coordinate things and bring them together and build this greater beast only just for survival. It doesn't even need to be necessarily ideological, but there is an ethnic component to that because, expanding it past ethnic boundaries, it just doesn't seem to work. Whatever you want to say about it. Like, why doesn't Italy form with fucking Spain? I'm like, well, it doesn't. They can't. There's some kind of wall there and they won't want to do it. Whatever. But that's at every step of the way, it's security and prosperity. And so that can be seen also at the national level, which is why he's saying that. And that's why in states, one thing he says, which I think is interesting, states actually don't want absolute power. There's actually not a lot of nations that want to control the world. And you can go back to Napoleon, you can go back to Hitler. They don't want to just own every fucking nation. But they feel like they need to because of relative power. Like the only reason you join up for the security and prosperity is because you fear someone else is doing the same. That's the nuclear arms race. Like, I need a nuke because they have nukes. I don't know what they're going to do. So as nations develop technologically, and as they get more people, a higher population, better production, most nations feel like they need to keep up just for security purposes. Like if your neighbors get guns, you better get a gun too. And that's really the simple arithmetic of all of it. That's what he's trying to say. It's like, look, a lot of these nations don't even want to be doing this, but they're willing. They'll do things that they don't want to do to secure the prosperity and security of this organization of people. And so no matter what you believe, you have to be willing to do that. Otherwise, you don't exist. You don't exist as a nation, really. I think that's a good way to go about it. And that's when he says, like, talking about like latent power before. It's like, okay, as a nation, how much power do you actually have? And he's got a part here that he's trying to figure out, like, how do you measure latent power? And some people use the GNP, which is the gross national product. And he says, the same problem arises with GNP is used to compare the latent power of contemporary China with Japan and the United States. Despite its rapid economic development over the past 2 decades, China is still a semi-industrialized state. Roughly 10% of its wealth remains tied up in agriculture. Japan and the United States, on the other hand, are highly industrialized states. Only 1% of their wealth is in agriculture. China, however, has almost 5 times as many people as the United States and about 10 times as many as Japan. Therefore, the balance of latent power among these 3 states will be biased in China's favor if GNP is the chosen measure. The problem is likely to go away with time because China's agricultural base will continue to shrink. It accounted for around 30% of their wealth in like 1980 as its economy modernizes. But for now, it must be factored into any analysis that uses GNP as a measure of China's latent power. Basically, he's trying to say that just judging a nation's power by like what they produce and stuff like how much are people buying, that's not actually a good measure of how much latent power it is. You got to look at the actual wealth, where the wealth is located, where it's invested, how much of your wealth is actually tied up in agriculture, which we'll get into this later on about how, a nation's ability to marshal its forces is directly tied to its modernized industry.
Right.
Not only it becomes more flexible and fluid, it can do stuff, but if it's just tied up in fucking corn, you can't really do much with that. And you can be threatened a lot more with corn than being able to make pinheads. And there's a summary here he does in short that I think anyone can say it's him, where it's the entire idea of offensive realism. So hold on. So offensive realism in brief. In its simplest form, my theory maintains that the basic structure of international system forces states concerned about their security to compete with each other for power. The ultimate goal of every great power is to maximize its share of world power and eventually dominate the system. In practical terms, this means that the most powerful states seek to establish hegemony in their region of the world while also ensuring that no rival great power dominates another area. This theory begins with 5 assumptions about the world, which are all reasonable approximations of reality. First of all, states are the key actors in international politics, and no higher authority stands above them. There's no ultimate arbiter or leviathan in the system that states can turn to if they get in trouble and need help. This is called an anarchic system as opposed to a hierarchic one. The next two assumptions deal with capabilities and intentions, respectively. All states have offensive military capabilities, although some have more than others, indeed, sometimes many more than others. Capabilities are reasonably easy to measure because they are largely composed of material objects and can be seen, assessed, and counted. Intentions are a different matter. States can never be certain about the intentions of other states because intentions are inside the heads of leaders and thus virtually impossible to see and difficult to measure. In particular, states can never know with complete confidence whether another state might have its gun sights on them for one reason or another. The problem of discerning states' intentions is especially acute when one ponders their future intentions, since it's almost impossible to know who the leaders of any country in 5 or more years from now will be, much less what they will think of foreign policy. So that's kind of where he's getting at. This is where you get into game theory stuff and why he calls it a tragedy of great power politics. The idea that once you get to this certain level, once you become a nation, you're in this whole other game, whether you like to or not. If you care about security, you will inevitably become a player in this game, and it doesn't matter whether or not you want to break the wheel about it. So it's like, what do you do next? So if you envision a world, or you want to envision a world, like I do, like a multipolar world, let us talk about a multipolar world where there is no war. I need more detail on what that looks like because this book would say that it's almost impossible. Based on history, based on what we know about how nation states act. This is what we know. So, like, how do you fix that? Because that's a deep problem. This is not just a psychological problem. It's like a philosophical problem. It's like, how do you make... You're trying to answer with no less than how do we make everyone just get along magically, because they're concerned about if you're a human being, you should be concerned about bad things that can happen with you. If you're concerned about bad things that happen to you, you should be concerned about these other states. And then they can say they won't invade you. That could be a lie. And you don't know who's going to be in charge in 5 or 10 years. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, okay, if you want to talk about world peace, someone needs to address this. And I haven't heard anyone address this, the practicality of what happens, because I see a world where more nations catch up to the West. Like we've got India, we've got Pakistan, we've got Iran, we've got maybe Africa's next, maybe South America. There's some big players in South America. There isn't really one right now, but let's say there is. That only complicates matters and increases the risk of conflict and I would argue just world destruction. So let's take Russia and China. Let's say that there is a multipolar world where America falls. Let's just say that. Okay. So we're living in this multipolar world where there is no American hegemon. There's, China, Russia, Iran, whatever as they sort out. Okay. And let's say that after the fall of American hegemony, after their union, that they decide, okay, we're just going to keep this balance forever. Now, what might very well happen is China decides to take Tibet. Let's say day after America falls, America just blinks out of existence. Everything's good. They take Tibet. And that wasn't part. We thought we could have this world where everything's balanced, everything remains the same, there's no divisions, and that everything was cool. Because all they wanted was not to have this, hegemon across an ocean. Day 1 after that happens, China takes Tibet, because they always wanted to. All right. Now, the reason they wanted to could be a variety of reasons. They can correctly believe or incorrectly believe that Tibet has historically belonged to China, that doesn't matter about their self-determination, blah, blah, blah. They could have actually ideological and historical reasons to do it, whether or not they're right or wrong. That could be a motivator for them. Sure. But now here's a new arena you enter where I believe Tibet, according to this book, Tibet is the 3rd largest freshwater source in the world. That might be why they want them right now. They might, all this stuff about Tibet identity and whatever, that may all just be a smokescreen for the fact that they want to control the water, whatever. So, but let's say it is ideological, and then they take Tibet. Now they are in control of the 3rd largest freshwater source in the world, and that is globally relevant. Now, Russia might want to have things remain the same, but now they're in a new reality where China now has this edge on them. And then like, okay, well, even though I don't want to invade, I got to keep the balance. So maybe even though I got nothing against China, I don't care about, I'm Russian. I don't give a shit about Tibet. I actually don't give a shit about what China does in their region. I just know the scales have tipped a bit. So now I need to do something to get a bit more power just to maintain balance. So now, in the interest of maintaining peace, now you're invading countries. Now you got boots on the ground. Now you've got civilian casualties, maybe. Now you've got rape, probably. Now, and this is all in the interest of multipolar peace. There has to be a rebalancing of things. So whatever drove them to want to pursue these land captures or these centralizations of power, doesn't matter. And it seems that the day after you achieve this magical peace, now there's decisions being made that might upset the balance, and people have to react to maintain balance and peace. Remember, that's what they're trying to do. And now we're invading countries. Now we're building nukes up. Now there's all kinds of crazy shit going on, just like it did before. And that's a reality that you find yourself right back into if everyone gets their wish now, apparently. This is why people want a one world government. So when people talk about us like we're crazy about this is what the globalists want, this is what the one, this is their solution. And they are pursuing this solution with every ounce of their being. And there's a lot of rich and powerful people who are doing this because they've read the same shit as us. And their answer to it is, oh, I see the solution to anarchy. It is actually having one judge for everyone, and then we can plug in our version of logic and reason to meet it. And maybe we tie artificial intelligence to that somehow. Maybe we make it less human. That's what they think. They're open about that. They're hoping that there's some kind of fucking computer that can do this. And they're putting millions, if not billions of dollars behind pursuing that. So that's one answer. What's our answer? I don't know what our answer is. I think we need one. You know what I mean? Maybe it's giving everyone nukes. Yeah. Maybe it is an ANCAP solution where everyone gets as many nukes as possible. That's one. Let's put that in the maybe pile. There's war. That's one way to do it. That's inevitable. There's other ways to do conflict. Blackmail is one. Nations blackmail. You do what Britain did, which is called buck passing. Buck passing it sounds what it's like. You get other nations to fight on your behalf. That's very popular. That's what Britain did for a lot of its time, kind of paying because it didn't want to project actual military power. But like America, you can invest in revolutions. You can invest in color revolutions. You can do that all the fucking time. You can do that till the cows come home. Or, if you're a smaller nation and you're trying to climb up the ladder, you're in a position where you need to appease larger powers, and then you could use appeasement or what's called bandwagoning. So if a nation, this is kind of what is going on in Ukraine right now. Like Russia wants part of Ukraine. It's like, okay, I'm going to appease them. Let's say I give them part of it. Well, you've just admitted that you don't have the power to stand on your own, really. That's actually why it's complicated for Ukraine right now. Whereas if I don't like Zelensky, but if it's anyone but Zelensky, they would be running the exact same calculations in their head where it's like, okay, if I give up this part of Ukraine, I'm going to be giving up all of it. And he's already given it up to America. Everyone knows that. So it's like, you're not a real country right now. That's what's unfortunate. It's like you're either going to be a vassal state of America, a slave state, or you're eventually going to become a slave state of Russia. That's where Ukraine is right now. And part of Ukraine's picking America. I think part of Ukraine's picking Russia. That's what that war is about. Well, it's about a lot of things, but that's one of the things the war is about, So that's a reality. Despite how much you might hate Zelensky for being a gay Jewish actor who... What else do we got about him? What's about Zelensky? He's 5'4". He's whatever thing you don't like about him. He makes weird TikTok videos, whatever. Swap out anyone else. They would have to deal with the same issue. And he says there's other cases throughout the 20th century where we actually see this at work. So a way out for China. This is where the concern about China is interesting, where Japan did this in the past, where it's like you can build like a manufacturing base with your partner nation. So it could be Japan or China partnered with Korea, Manchuria, wherever else. to, create unity that way. So you can actually build these unities through trade and kind of gather that power. But that's why you might want to have Japan, disorganized. That's why everyone's worried about, the relationships China has right now. And that he makes the case, and I think this is a case that is commonly made, and I think it's true. Like, why did America get involved in World War II? I thought people forget what a contender Japan was. Like, a lot of people forget Japan beat Russia in a war. Like a land war. Japan beat Russia, and Japan beat China in a war. Japan was a contender. And one of the reasons he says that America was so interested in taking out Japan was, Pearl Harbor. This is before Pearl Harbor. The conspiracy that America knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen. Well, yeah, they did, because America was actually trying to pressure Japan, because America was trying to destabilize Japan because it had such a stranglehold on all of its Asian neighbors. And then after World War II, you get modern Japan, which is under the thumb of America, which is actually what they wanted. So there is a case to be made in the book that all of these wars, you can say there's an ideological backing to it, or that's what the generals tell the people. But everyone knows, the wars in the Middle East. Like, was that about freedom? Was that about women's rights? We might say that, but not really. Or maybe these days the military might believe that because it's full of those types of people. But, the idea is it's like, oh, we got to check these people. Patrice O'Neill back on a Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn, he called it pretty well. This would have been back right after 9/11. And he had said, fucking America just has to be a gangster. It just has to go in and fuck some people up, and everyone kind of laughed because that's a black guy thing to say. I'm like, no, but really though, that's what America's got to do. There's a lot of people talking shit. You got to go in like a gangster, like a pimp. You got to kick some ass, let people know that you can still do it. And that's really all there needs to be to it. And then long-term trying to just take people's land. And at that point, he says a lot of what is classically seen as a military blunder makes a lot more sense once you actually look at the history and view it from this thing. Like, people are like, why the fuck did Japan just randomly decide to attack America? That's what people think. You talk to regular people and they'll be confused as to why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. They think, and to this day, people think that, Putin is invading Ukraine because he's insane. He just lost his mind, and that every war is caused by some man losing his mind. I'd say half of the population thinks that, if not half, then a third. Let's say a third of the population thinks that it's just bullies versus nerds. That's how they see war. But once you see it through this thing, like, oh, Japan attacking America's retaliation actually makes sense. Here's why America was going after Japan, because people don't get, why is Japan and America even having a war? Why is Britain pressuring Germany so much and Hitler? Like, we won't get into that whole theater of war, but we did a review of a book, Hitler's Revolution, that it actually shows the power struggle was between Germany and Britain and France. It's not actually just a guy. They elected a guy who loved war, and Germany lost its mind for a few years. That's what they believe too, which doesn't make any fucking sense. Anyway, long term, he's saying that with this in mind, you see what China's doing. You see why China's trying to kind of coagulate its forces in the region, become a regional hegemon. And again, like I said, there will be people who disagree with how much, culture or spirituality or ideology plays into it. And we're not saying that, the French Revolution didn't have its ideological driving force. That Soviets could have very well, they were ideologically possessed. They did it because they believed in what they believe. And I'm sure there's a lot of military generals who believe what they believe. The problem is that once you are established, you will see these people betray what are supposed to be their principles, like the Soviet Union. Like, with the Soviet Union, given the high-minded Marxist principles they had, they started to behave in like a nation concerned about security and having to make practical concessions that might have very well gone against their principles, but they just got to do it because they're still just a fucking nation, even though they're fighting to abolish nations, which is what they'll say. It's like, oh, we have to do this in the future. We'll just get rid of nations. But, It's called an offensive realism. Despite how ideological and spiritual you want to be, you have to employ offensive realism. And the people who think you don't are probably destined to fail. They're probably just going to remain, academic movements who got like a bunch of cool rhetoric and books, but they can't play this game. They're not set up to play the game because they don't think they have to. Anyway, that's all I wanted to end on with that.
Oh, that's good.
All right,
Mearsheimer.
And like I said, he's got a site. I think he's got like a site and a journal. Well, I guess there's Mearsheimer.com. You guys go to Mearsheimer.com. I think he's got kind of a cool site.
Ooh.
Oh yeah, he runs Foreign Affairs magazine. Yeah, so like you'll find his articles and all kinds of shit. Oh, he's got on his site. He's got a painting of him as Machiavelli. Oh no, is that him? Yeah. Or maybe that is him, but it's called Mearsheimer.
Mearsheimer. Oh,
yeah.
No.
Oh no. See, he's not beyond just being a meme guy.
Dude's rocking.
No one is.
Yeah.
We got a case of a dude rocking. Sound the alarms.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.